It was on a cold October day that I got a letter from Gorham Leonard inviting me to speak to him about my request to spend the night in one of the more obscure haunted houses in the world. Leonard had purchased the Poldrict House 18 years before, and it had sat, mostly ignored and in disrepair, in Albany, New York ever since. In November, I flew to Sarasota to see him. I had heard plenty of stories about Leonard, stories of how the 7 years he'd spent attempting to exorcise a dock worker in Algiers had ruined him and turned him into a physical shell of what he had once been. 30 seconds after he opened the door to his little house to let me in, it was pretty obvious that most of the stories were true. A wave of heat, not air conditioning, flowed over me, and he immediately apologized for it. He'd been suffering the sensation of always being very cold since about 2008. On that 80-degree day, he was wearing a heavy sweater, a scarf, and thin gloves over his hands. He moved very slowly, a 50-year-old man who looked 70. And he wasn't shy about describing his physical ailments to me. Occasional blindness in one eye, an inability to eat for days at a time, insomnia, constant bronchial infections, arthritis, numbness in his feet that sometimes rendered him unable to walk. He hadn't left his home in 4 years. They said it was all because of the toll the exorcism had taken. That dock worker, who was a man of 67 when Leonard had met him, had become inexplicably possessed by the spirit of his own dead twin, who had died at the age of 9. But that day we only talked about the Poldrict House. What I would find there, he said, would not be much, and I would probably leave very disappointed. There was a slight chance, though, that the trip might be a dangerous one. You see, there are two ways to bring out the possible malevolence of a ghost. The first one, of course, is to attempt to touch it or act upon it in a belligerent way. The second was discovered much, much later in the timeline of the history of paranormal research. And it was discovered by accident by Gorham Leonard himself in 1987 during his explorations of the tombs of ancient soldiers in Heraclea. It was this second trigger that Leonard was somewhat worried about in the case of the Poldrict House, and it was the reason he'd been so careful over the years in allowing access to it. I would be only the fourth person to enter the place in the last 2 decades. He gave me the keys, wished me good luck, and sent me on my way, only after making sure he had a cell phone number should he need to contact me. I drove back to the airport right away. From LaGuardia on the other end, it was a 3-hour trip to the Poldrict House. It sat on a long downslope in the corner of a small, wooded lot at the edge of a lower middle-class neighborhood, about a mile down the road from a junkyard, and about a quarter-mile away from the nearest inhabited house. Leonard spent just enough money on upkeep to make sure it had very stout locks all over, and appear vaguely inhabited so no one would break in. He went so far as to pay to have a couple of cars parked there all the time, cars which were occasionally switched out for one another by a hired hand who was forbidden to enter the house. There wasn't much that could be done about the lights inside, so when a bulb burned out, it stayed out. And Leonard told me quite frankly that if so many of the lamps hadn't fizzled out over the past year, he might have refused my request for entry. I entered the house at 2:00 p.m. on November 12th. What was left of the decor was forgettably early American, covered in dust, just enough of it remaining to offer an uncomfortable one-night stay. There were no linens, no dishes, nothing in the cabinets, no real possessions. What remained were the things the last owners had never taken with them when they left in 1979, leaving the place to slowly decay. Leonard had told me that, like the owners previous to them, they had been petrified the first night, but never again saw the ghost which had visited them. It is rare that the cause of an authentic haunting is simply never discovered, but that was exactly the case with the Poldrict House, named after the original owners, about whom no one knew anything but a last name from a faded 19th century lease with an incorrect address, and some dusty documents that hinted the purchaser may have been an accountant. Both I and Leonard himself had exhausted the usual channels of information, only to find nothing about the Poldrict family, or those who had come after them, that was very useful. The closest I'd ever had to a breakthrough was going down a rabbit hole for a month, seeking traces of truth in a single comment by an old professor of mine, who claimed that he'd read that the case had something to do with a wedding ring. Where he'd come across this information, he hadn't been able to recall. I walked through the house, changing fuses and bulbs. I looked briefly into all the barren rooms, including the squalid, spider-infested cellar. And then I sat with a notebook and a pen beside the front window to watch the daylight fade. I'd been working for weeks on a poem that wouldn't resolve itself. At a little past 6, I ate a couple of protein bars and drank a bottle of water, and I sat and I waited. I could just barely see the road beyond the upslope. No cars drove down it for as long as I watched. I texted Leonard that I was in the house and safe. I didn't get any response. The first clue that something was going to happen was a sudden rush of almost overwhelming fatigue, so bad my eyes closed involuntarily and my chin dropped to my chest before I roused myself. I would describe it as an attack. I tensed up. This had happened to me twice before, and in both instances, it was a prologue to an occurrence just an hour or so afterward. I fought through the fatigue, minute by minute, pacing the room. At 7:15, I heard the footsteps. They were coming from beyond the living room, out in the tiny foyer, and beyond that. I walked 10 feet in the direction of the cellar, and I could determine that they originated behind the door that closed it off. Light footsteps on the slowly rotting wooden staircase that sat in the dark, decades in and decades out. Coming up toward the door. I stood in the center of the living room and I waited. I wished I had more light, but I'd neglected to turn on more than a single lamp in the corner. Through the entrance to the room, I could see beyond to where the cellar door now pushed outward. I was sweating, shaking just a little. A woman appeared there, emerging from the cellar, a very thin woman of average height. She left the door ajar and moved toward the living room to meet me. She was wearing the dark, featureless clothing of a 19th century housewife. Her hair was pulled back tight. She appeared to be about 40 years old. She looked at me half quizzically, half with familiarity. She stopped several feet away from me, and then she spoke the same single sentence that she'd uttered to the two families who had lived here uneventfully after her first reported appearance, and to the few who had visited briefly afterward. Addressing me as someone named Herman, she asked if I would like something to eat or drink while I did my work. I didn't answer. Her stare was fixed, and she moved not at all. 30 full seconds passed, and she turned away from me, seeming neither vexed nor disappointed. It was as if the ghost were simply following a script to its resolution. She moved out of the living room. The only further detail I noted as she walked away was a large dust print on her right shoulder. She went past the cellar door and began to ascend the staircase that led upstairs to a pair of bedrooms. I allowed her to get about halfway up and then I followed. When I got to the bottom of the staircase, treading very lightly, she was already at the top, back in darkness. I saw her turn to the right, and that was the last I saw of her. The upstairs hallway was deserted when I reached the top, and so were the bedrooms and the single bath. In that bathroom, I stared down through a filthy window toward the woods that bordered the property and stretched east. I thought I saw something moving in them, some shape in the trees, some ill-defined shadow. It stopped and started just too far away to know if it was animal, human, or otherwise. Finally, there was no trace of what it might have been, and I turned away. And so, my encounter with the ghost was in every respect identical to those of the others who had seen her, no different at all. None of us had had to wait more than several hours to meet her. I knew there would be little point in me staying inside the house, but I stayed anyway, texting Leonard, who answered only once with the letters OK, until I absolutely had to lay down on the couch nearby. When I awoke, I was alone, and rain was falling outside. It was 8 a.m., and time to return to my own home. It all felt like an anticlimax for months as I went about my other work, but I never fully left the case of the Poldrict House behind. I found it more mysterious than my colleagues did. I'd underlined the words wedding ring inside the notebook I kept about the house. The ghost had been wearing one, I noticed. I exchanged 2 more letters with Leonard. In the last one he wrote to me, he mentioned I should consider myself somewhat lucky. What he was referring to was the second way to very suddenly bring out the malevolence inside a ghost, if it indeed held any within it. This was to stumble upon the secret as to why the ghost remained so tortured. All of them carried either an immense amount of guilt or a torturous yearning to fulfill a destiny which had been thwarted. And in some cases there was something deeply sinister about what they knew, and which had never been found out. The most important advance in the field of paranormal research of the past 30 years had been Gorham Leonard's discovery that the moment a spirit's secret was discovered, by anyone at all, the anger, the rage, and the agony were unleashed, posing great danger to the spirit's next visitor. In the case of the Poldrict House, it seemed more and more likely that if the strange woman who offered something to eat or drink while Herman went about his work did possess the capacity to become dangerous, her trigger would never be found. And maybe there was simply none at all, and she was just a mournful, lost soul, unable to rest because of the regular human sorrows that engulf so many of us. The course of my work took me far away from Albany over the next 2 years, and there was simply no more time to investigate the case between teaching assignments and archaeological digs throughout Eastern Europe. One evening I went to a lecture at the University of Warsaw. The topic was the physical toll paranormal research like mine could take. And a slide came up showing an old man hunched over in a wheelchair. He was looking at the camera blankly, unsmiling. It took me more than a minute to realize that it was Gorham Leonard I was looking at. The photo had been taken just a few months before the lecture. Since I had seen him, he had gone into steeper decline. About 10 months after that lecture, I received news that Gorham Leonard had died. He'd gone in a most unusual, cryptic way. After years of literally not leaving his house, he'd one day limped into town, wearing his usual cold weather apparel, and found his way to a cheap chain restaurant, where he'd sat down and ordered a pot of coffee. At some point, he'd gone into the men's room. A half hour later, a manager was alerted that someone was in there with the door locked and was not responding. Finally, he broke in. He found Leonard on his knees in front of the sink. His head was immersed in 6 inches of water, and he'd somehow drowned in it. On the very same day, and in the very same hour, an old man named Ralph Dufranc, living across the Atlantic in Algiers, had tied a large rock to his leg and pushed it off a pier. This was the man Leonard had helped to successfully exorcise over the course of 7 long years. Or maybe it hadn't been such a success after all. In June, I was in Manhattan, following up on rumors that 2 divers working at the bottom of the Hudson River, having descended there as part of a salvage mission hours after a small jet crashed into the water, killing 12, had reported seeing something truly bizarre in the black, icy deep. They swore that by the lights dropped down to 200 feet, they'd seen a pair of hunched, human-like figures carrying 2 of the victims' bodies into the darkness, walking on the muddy floor and somehow disappearing when pursued. But I was called away from that by an email from an attorney telling me that I had inherited something from Gorham Leonard. A phone call revealed that he had willed the Poldrict House to me. There was no formal explanation aside from a note that the attorney read to me. In it, Leonard wished me well with the house and hoped that I would either use it in my research or sell it to fund other projects. It was that simple. The attorney offered to overnight the necessary papers for me to sign, and I gave him the address of my hotel. Because I was only a few hours away from the house, I drove out there the very next night, June 15th, to take a look at what was now the grandest possession I'd ever owned. I was still intrigued by it, but more so perhaps by the thought of what fieldwork its sale might finance than the presence which dwelt within. Though it was past sunset when I got to the house, I could see it was much like I'd left it. 2 lamps were still lit, perhaps from my first visit, as I had no idea if anyone else had come here in the interim. 1 compact car was parked in the drive, and I recognized it as one of the dummy cars Leonard had arranged for. The area around the house was unchanged, still struggling. In the package the attorney had sent me were the carefully wrapped keys to the house, 5 of them in all. It took me several minutes of standing in the dark to figure out, by trial and error, which ones opened the front door. I'd nearly given up, figuring Leonard may have had the locks changed, when the deadbolt turned over. And then I was back in the Poldrict House. Once inside, I didn't really feel the desire to explore. I'd seen everything there was to see. I suppose I did want to encounter the ghosts again, but the odds that that would happen, with me having seen her before, were almost nil. So I didn't expect for her to come up the basement stairs to ask me if I, a stand-in for someone named Herman, who seemed to have been her accountant husband in the late part of the 19th century, wanted something to eat or drink while I did my work. Looking briefly into the living room, I saw that the small writing table, where I had some time ago worked on a poem, was still set up beside the window. I set the package from Leonard's attorney on it, and I sat down to go through it, signing whatever needed to be signed. Even now, a year after that night, sitting here in my house in Atlanta, my hands shaking as I write, and my skin now so sensitive I sometimes can't go out on windy days, I am astounded by the awfulness of my timing in visiting the house. Had I only gone through those papers back at my hotel, I would have discovered how the diligence, access to obscure legal documents, and blind luck that Leonard's attorney possessed had uncovered something terrible, something which suddenly made me extremely vulnerable. You see, in trying to appraise the house's value, he'd located the original lease, not a scan of it, and having no preconceptions of the handwritten name shown on it, he'd typed the name he saw into a genealogical database as Poldrice, not Poldrict, visually perceiving the last letter differently than anyone had before. This had led him to uncover the fact that the only Albany family named Poldrict actually had no relation to the house. Every dead end became agonizingly clear. The house had been briefly foreclosed upon after the sudden death of Herman Poldrice, a death long since forgotten, but which had shocked the police when they came upon the scene on June 2nd, 1887. Gorham Leonard's attorney now knew something no one else living did. At exactly 8 p.m., as I finished reading a photocopy of a 125-year-old county court document that sent a shiver down my spine, giving me my first alarmed thoughts of leaving the house now, right now, I heard a noise from the basement. It was a sharp thump, as if something heavy and blunt had struck a block of wood. This was followed by a piercing shriek of pain coming from a woman's throat. Then 2 more thumps. As I began to rise from my chair, knocking the papers onto the floor, the shriek was repeated again and again at quick intervals, and each time it became less a howl of physical agony than of rage. And then came the sound of heavy footsteps on the basement stairs, not slow this time, but running fast. I was too frightened to move even an inch further. I wouldn't be able to get out of the living room and into the foyer in time to avoid what was coming for me. The door to the cellar flew open, and the ghost appeared. She strode into the room where I stood, overcome with terror. In her right hand, Emily Poldrice held her left one, which she had chopped off with a butcher knife. Blood poured from the unwrapped stump. She thrust the hand toward me, her face covered in sweat, her eyes wild. She screamed, "Here! If your whore in Boston wants jewelry, give her this too." And the last thing I remember before waking up 2 days later in a heap outside the front door, hungry and dazed, was the way she shook her gray, bloody, dismembered hand so as to make me see the wedding ring on it, now wrapped around a lifeless finger. The madness of the mentally ill Emily Poldrice, the fury which had been building for years and boiled forth one night in 1887, resulted in her own death by blood loss, but not before she'd savagely bludgeoned her unfaithful husband with the poker kept beside the living room fireplace. I did not suffer her physical wrath, no, that would have been impossible, but I have suffered nonetheless, overpowered and infected by that unleashed malevolence. Colleagues tell me I will get better, that the nightmares will stop, my heart will strengthen, the hemophilia will be cured, and I'll stop shaking and feeling such pain. I must be patient, they say, and wait, and stay busy. Until that unlikely time, I spend my days reading, trying to stay warm, and living off the money from the insurance payment that came after I arranged for the Poldrice house to be burned to the ground. Whether Emily Poldrice will now rest in peace, or roam the lonely woods to the east of the property forever, appearing to unlucky wanderers in the dead of night, that remains to be seen. But I vow to you, not by me.